Hello, everyone.
Hello.
I'm Carlos Carnicero Uravalle. I am the editor-in-chief of Future is Blue, the weekly newsletter promoted by Funcas Europe and Agenda Pública. And today we're here to talk about France and how the COVID-19 crisis is affecting France and how are the French perceiving the actions taken by the European Union. So we're joined by two great analysts that they know a lot about economy and about France and about the European Union. So it's going to be very interesting. I'm joined by Agnès Benassi-Coeur, professor at Université Paris 1 Panthéon-Sorbonne, and by Bruno Cotre, researcher at CEVIPOF, the research center at Sciences Po. So thank you both for joining us today. And I think we need to start with the Franco-German proposal we've seen in the last days. It sounds very ambitious on paper, 500 billion euros, composed mostly by grants and not loans, which is a very controversial issue for some member states. So it sounds good on paper, but of course, I want to know what are your initial thoughts on this. Agnès, would you like to start on this one?
With pleasure. So first, thanks for the invitation. So I think this is a very important agreement, even if at the end it doesn't come up in this form. I think it will be an important step. Why? Already before the COVID crisis, there was a lot of discussion about the fiscal tool at euro area level or EU level. And there are two dimensions for this. So the EU, as you know, the EU budget needs to be balanced year after year. So this is not fiscal policy. The mother of fiscal policy, in a sense, is the ability of a budget to be imbalanced, either a deficit in bad times or in a surplus in good times. So this was not the case. It was only at the level of the member states. So it was known that it was a big fault line of the construction, both because it could not deliver some one-off transfers across countries in case of an asymmetric shock, and also because in case of a big symmetric shock, it would all the burden of the adjustment would be put on the ECB. So we knew it already before the crisis, and then comes the crisis. And of course, this problem re-emerges. And so at the beginning, what the EU has done is to give governments more leeway to do fiscal policy by relaxing the fiscal rules. And then progressively we moved on. So we have the ESM, pandemic credit line, which is borrowing facility for member states. We have now the SURE facility, which is for short time work schemes. But this is still not a budget in the traditional sense. So for the first time, we have something that looks like a budget with own resources. I think this is a very important key word in the agreement. Own resources. Why is it so important? Because you don't know who pays actually. So it breaks the juste retour problem we already had, and we are going to have actually with this discussion. Which with each government calculating the difference between what he pays or she pays and what is received. And also because we need, it's going to be debt, European debt, but still debt. So we need to increase the tax base of the member states as a whole in order to serve this debt. So there are two ways of doing it, own resources or more cooperation, and in order to plug the holes that are still there in the corporate income tax, in the VAT and other taxes. So I think this is really important because it's consistent also with the Green Deal project, and because it's the first time we really have something that looks like fiscal policy.
Great. Thank you, Agnès. Bruno, would you like to react to that? What are your thoughts on this deal? Is it as good as it sounds?
Yes, many thanks for this invitation first. Yes, indeed, the Merkel and Macron announcement is obviously very significant, very important, very motivating object. Yes, it's really the first time that we have a budget issue finally. So obviously, I like the idea, but I would say that we have some, you know that always the devil is in the details. So I would like to put 2 points. The first point is that exactly as Agnes was saying, at one stage, someone is going to pay. So you need to precise exactly the way that this is going to be reimbursed, who is going to do it, with what timing, and also with the tax issue going with that. So this point should be clarified at one stage. But there is another point, which is my main perspective when I'm analyzing EU politics, which is with a political sociology point of view, which is the point of view of the citizens. Actually, we know since many years that one of the main problems of the EU is going to be the relationship with the citizens. On that aspect, there are 2 very, very important points. One point is how the European citizens are going to see, empirically speaking, the consequences of that. It's a very important point when you are announcing a big investment or a big plan, which is who is going to take and to get the benefit from that. It's going to be very important. It can't be like a rainfall of money. So you need to precise where, who, when is going, who are going to be the recipients of all of that. I just want to remind that we've got in 2015 a big plan, an investment plan that was a Jean-Claude Juncker plan, with a very important also amount that was nearly 500 billion also, with the very important role of the European Fund for Investment, with the European Bank for Investment. And obviously, we had some practical, empirical products and consequences in the reality, but it's going to be a very important point. The other point, and we will see that, I guess, in a few minutes, is going to be how this is going to be validated at one stage, if there is at one stage that someone is going to pay, how this is going to be, democratically speaking, validated by the citizens. And we just don't know the details of that, but at the democratic point of view, it's not a detail.
Okay, before, I think you touched on the expectations element of the citizens, and I think that's very, very important. But before that, I wanted to ask Agnes maybe about, there are 4 member states at least that are very much against these elements that this plan has. And these are the Netherlands, Austria, Denmark, and who's the 4th? Sweden, yes. So Agnes, in your view, how can we persuade these countries that so far are saying, we don't want to talk about grants, we are ready for loans, but not grants? So I think maybe in some way, in some kind of conditionality in the way that this money is invested in the regions that are mostly affected? Or did you see another a key element to convince the most reluctant? I think it's a good signal that Germany is part of this deal with France, because Germany has been aligned with those northern countries in these matters before. So I think that's positive, but still there are some member states saying, listen, we're going to present our own proposal. So what's your view on that one, Agnes?
Very good question. So I think there are 2 main arguments. The first one is that due to global warming, there will be new shocks. Maybe the next shock will be a big flood. As you know, the Netherlands is below the sea level. In the past, there have been some very, very severe floods in Central Europe. So these things can happen. So next time, it may be your turn. Because, and in a sense, it's unfortunate that this crisis hit more southern countries that are already hit by a very different crisis 10 years ago. So it would have been easier if it had been another country which was not at the center of the previous crisis. Second way, but maybe more immediate way to convince is very difficult because it's based on something that we economists think very naturally, but it's not the general public and not the politicians think like that. It's the notion of counterfactual. What if we don't do it? What if the ECB doesn't do the QE? What if the governments do not come up with a fiscal response? And then the stake is very high. These are small open economies. So these are the countries that benefit the most from both the EU and for those who are part of the euro area from the single currency. And it is the very existence of the EU and of the euro area that are at stake. I think that at some point, it may be that one country has no other choice than to print money to fund itself. At some point, governments may decide to stop the integration and to rely on themselves to repatriate some industries. So we will no longer have the benefit from the single market. And countries like the Netherlands, they live on the single market, the Rotterdam port and the trade and the value chains. So this is at the heart of their growth model. So in a sense, small countries have more to lose than big countries from a disruption of the single market.
Those are very good points. Sorry, go ahead, finish, Agnès, please.
No, I finished.
Finish. Yeah, okay. Now I was gonna give Bruno the opportunity to comment. I think your points are very valid. What is at stake is everything, and we all benefit from this big thing that we give for granted, that is the EU, and these northern member states benefit so much with the single market and so on. So I think the argument is sounds strong. I'm not sure if it works. Hopefully it will work, but let's see. Bruno, what's your view on this topic?
Yes, I really think that what Agnès just raised are absolutely fundamental points for the future of EU. If we want EU to get a little bit more support of the populations and of the citizens, to give a long-term perspective is absolutely essential, and particularly on public policies or on socioeconomic or policy issues that are transnational by nature, by definition. So anything that concerns climate change, anything that concerns epidemic is also by nature transnational. And I think that if the EU would like to get more support, which is from the population, and you know that it's one of the most difficult points for the EU on today. In so many countries, you have Eurosceptics or people that are more negative to the EU. So it is absolutely essential that EU shows its ability and its policy ambitions to handle transnational problems. And I think it should be the directions for the future of EU in the next decades, I would say. And probably it means a very important clarification at the political level, at the institutional level, what EU can do, what EU cannot do. And I would like to see that clarification, because when you talk to the European citizens, many of them are saying that they like the broad idea of European integrations. They are supporting peace, prosperity, democracy, okay? But many citizens are saying, okay, once that you said this very general statement, what EU is doing, what EU is not doing for me necessarily, but what EU is doing concretely speaking for the country, for the inequalities, for this kind of things, where is the add value? It looks very obvious for EU specialists like you or me, but for many citizens, it's not so obvious. So what Agnès said is absolutely fundamental and essential. This kind of policy, big question, should be put ahead of the EU agenda. if we want to use that, that big budget for something which is structural, which is long-term, particularly. It can't be just for reacting to the epidemic. It's good, obviously, but if it is just that, it won't be so ambitious. So the long-term ambition and the long-term perspective should be put ahead.
So let's look into that in France. I want to know about the expectations of the French with the EU. Obviously, last year we had Brexit. Well, it's been going on for some years, but finally it's been Brexit materialized. One member state leaving. We've had, Viktor Orban in Hungary. We've got Marine Le Pen making it to the second round of the French presidential election. So obviously, how citizens perceive the EU response now, it's something very, very, very fundamental. So looking into France, Agnes, how are the French so far perceiving the EU's response, and maybe what do they expect from the EU in these unprecedented, challenging times?
Okay, so I'm not a political scientist, so I will leave it to Bruno to comment on population expectations and sentiments vis-à-vis the European integration. What I see in the economic debate, staying at the level of economic debate, in France, the economic debate is not very sophisticated, so people are mainly talking about taxation, so tax the rich in order to plug plug the hole, and monetization the debt. So there's a lot of misunderstanding about what the ECB can do and cannot do. It's difficult to understand that the ECB is a public held bank. So if there are losses at the level of the ECB, it doesn't change anything because it's just moving deficit from one hand to the other hand of the public body. But nevertheless, there is something here that is important, a message behind that, that is much more serious, which is what I was saying before. So at some point, we will need to raise taxes. And it needs to be progressive, it needs to be fair, perceived as fair. And here we need more cooperation. And we know that it's extremely difficult because we have a decision-making system which relies on unanimity. So I think ideally coming out of the crisis, we will need more progressive tax schedules. The rich in any member states should pay relatively more than the poor, including in Bulgaria and Romania, where in these countries you have flat tax systems, very flat tax systems. So this is a debate that has never arose in the EU, even when the Americans were discussing the wealth tax. This didn't cross the Atlantic. This is very strange. So this is an issue. Now, the French, in the French system, as we know, the labor market is relatively rigid. So you can expect a large increase in unemployment. Before the crisis, there were very significant reforms of the training systems, training and retraining. This will be a test. So I think the sentiment vis-à-vis the crisis and Europe in general, because people mix up everything, they don't know what is due to the EU, what is due to the French government. I think a big test will be the impact on unemployment and whether we are able to reallocate work faster than in the past.
Okay, Bruno, thank you, Agnes. Bruno, your take on this one, on the French, how they are perceiving the EU reacting and what they expect from the common action of the 27 and Brussels.
Yes. Now we turn to the very difficult, very difficult point. How to explain that? I would say first that when you look to the public opinion surveys, and not only during the crisis, but long before the crisis. If you looked at the Eurobarometer survey of data since many years, and that you would like to make a geography of public support to the EU at the European level, you could say that France is among the most negative countries. Actually, the level of negative attitude in the French population is about the same of the UK.
As the UK, yes.
I know it looks a bit upsetting and shocking, but the level of negative attitude among France, but also you could say Greece, but also you could say Italy, is about the same level as the UK. So the most negative countries, I would say, if you look to the Eurobarometer, you could see that about 60% of the French are saying that they have no trust in the EU. So that's the bad news. The good news is that actually, when you look even more carefully to the data, you could see that there is a segment of the French population which is more ambivalent to the EU than Eurosceptic. I would not qualify the French public towards the EU of a Eurosceptic. It's not hard Euroscepticism. By hard Euroscepticism, I mean like for the Brexit. I mean like for the British, where it's going to be a negative attitude for the principle of the integration. It's not that much the case in France, even if you have a little part of the French population which is opposed to the EU by definition. The most important attitude in the French population is negative ambivalence, which is that there is no way that the French public would like to go out. There will be never a Frexit. That's absolutely certain. But so many people are just wondering why. Why are we in? With whom? Where are we going? For doing what exactly? So the general mood is more negative than positive, but the little positive news is that you have a segment of the population which is just wondering what EU is doing, with whom, where are we going, which is the ambivalent part. Last point, there is a permanent, I would say there is a structural and permanent problem in the EU policies, which is that there is this mythic idea that EU is moving and that EU is changing and that EU is evaluating by crisis. And that when there is a crisis, you have a government initiative or executive initiative like Angela Merkel and Emmanuel Macron recently, and that crisis development with a sudden decision is the only way for EU to move. I think it's a big mistake. I think it's a big error to have this reasoning, because at the end of the day, EU is just a political construction. It's just a political project, and you cannot have a political project which is not asking the population their wish, their attitudes, what they want. And you cannot justify everything by a management of crisis, which is too complex for the population, and that you need leaders that are going to make the situation to evaluate. It is like if you have exactly the same at the national level, no one would accept that at the national level. Why should we at the European level? I have no response to that complex question, but I know that that complex question can't be put aside by saying it's not a problem. Let's move and let's put that problem aside.
Thank you, Bruno. I agree with you. We can give integration for granted, and I think that's what we do when we say by crisis we're going to evolve, because we had the refugee crisis and we don't have today a common refugee policy. So yeah. I don't think that applies anymore. But before we finish, Agnes, I want to ask you a final question before we finish about the impact of the crisis in France from an economic point of view. Maybe you can tell us how bad it is compared to other states, how much you are exposed? Because we talked before in Future is Blue about the southern Europe, and we said, well, for let's say for objective reasons, it's very much exposed to this crisis because of the dependency on the sector service, dependency on tourism. So obviously there are some key specific factors that are affecting some countries more than others. So what about in France? What is the how vulnerable is France? How well prepared is France? Final word on this topic that is very big, is complex, and I'm challenging you to finish this conversation with a final thought on this one that could move us into another debate only about this topic. But time is how it is. So Agnes, give us your view on this one.
So it's very difficult to guess what will be the final impact of the crisis in the different countries. You have the direct impact of the lockdown. The different statistical institutes have made some calculations about the drop in GDP in the first quarter of this year, but based on different methodologies. So I would not overinterpret the differences across countries. For instance, the fact that GDP seems to have fallen less in Italy than in France, which is a bit of a surprise. Maybe the methodology behind that, the way they use, in particular, real-time data, big data, like credit cards or things like that, may differ across countries. So I would not put too much weight on this. But also, I wanted to stress the fact that it's not a final issue, because then you have structural issues coming up. Maybe tourism, as you mentioned, would be hit for longer time. Maybe also the car industry, the aeronautics, of course airlines, but this is in all countries. So the Germany industry, for instance, Germany has been less affected by the lockdown, but is more affected by the fall in the car purchases. And also because it's so dependent on other countries. So the car industry in Germany cannot recover completely if the car industry in Italy doesn't recover. So, and look at Sweden. Sweden is not doing very well, despite the fact that they didn't have a lockdown. So the lockdown itself is not the end of the story. And France, so coming back to France, France, of course, is well integrated in value chains, not only Europeans, also non-EU value chains. So in that, it will suffer. It's also exposed to tourism, to car industry, aeronautics, so sectors that are very, very deeply hit. But at the same time, it's a big country, so it's less open by definition. It has, for instance, strong, well, maybe not so strong, but well-spread agriculture. So some sectors that are less affected, although the mobility of the workers, the reduced mobility of the workers is really a problem today. So France is a relatively diversified economy. So this increases the resilience compared to some other countries that would be more exposed to only one or two industries. For instance, if you take tourism, the share of tourism in GDP is much higher in Spain than in France. So I would expect that over a medium term, the activity is more affected in Spain than in France. But you never know, because also it depends on whether there will be new waves of the pandemic. So everything is provisional.
Everything is provisional except our newsletter Future is Blue. In these uncertain times, at least we can have great analysis. And I think this was a great way to finish. And yes, thank you for those points on the navigating the uncertainties. Of course, anything we can assume these days is very fragile. So, but I think those are very good points. I want to thank you both. This was very interesting, and we'll keep talking. I think this is gonna last for a while, and we need to bring good analysis for what's happening. So Agnes, Bruno, thank you and stay safe.
Very well. Thank you, Carlos.
Thanks so much, Carlos.
Thank you.
Have a good day. Bye-bye.
Have a good day. Bye-bye.